And I had this experience with this little boy, he's 5 years old, and saw his face, and he at one point during the investigation, he ran to me and grabbed me and he said, "I don't belong here," and just crying.
From the filthy holds of slave ships crossing the Atlantic to the filthy streets of India, the plague of slavery has destroyed lives and influenced history for centuries, including the 21st century. The most common misconception in U.S. history is the idea that slavery ended in 1865. Slavery has been in existence from the beginning of the human race. The most devastating and infamous slave trade in the New World was the exchange of Africans in the transatlantic slave trade. An estimated 9 to 11 million people were taken out of Africa and shipped to British, Spanish, Danish, French, Portuguese, and Dutch civilizations in North and South America. Only 5.7% of the slaves taken out of Africa were brought to the British colonies in North America, now known as the United States. A shocking 21.1% was shipped to the British West Indies, which now includes Haiti, Cuba, and Jamaica. The civilization with the largest amount of African slaves was Brazil, with a devastating 32.2%. Slaves worked in the production of tobacco crops and later cotton. With the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, along with the growing demand for the product in Europe, the use of slaves in the South became a foundation of their economy. In the late 18th century, the abolitionist movement began in the North, and the country began to divide over the issues between North and South. Abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass, Angelina Grimke, and William Lloyd Garrison helped bring this issue forward. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise banned slavery in all new Western territories, which Southern states saw as a threat to the institution of slavery itself. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a member of the anti-slavery Republican Party, to the presidency in 1860, convinced many Southerners that slavery would never be permitted to expand into new territories acquired by the U.S. and might ultimately be abolished. 11 Southern states attempted to secede from the Union, precipitating the Civil War. During the war, Abraham Lincoln issued his famous Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves in all areas of the country that were at that time in rebellion. In 1865, after the Civil War, killing 620,000 people, the United States abolished slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Every other country has abolished slavery. And at the dawn of the 21st century, in 2001, the international community recognized the slave trade as a crime against humanity. Despite the abolishment of slavery worldwide, there is an estimated 27 million people in slavery. That's double the number that came out of Africa in the entire transatlantic slave trade. This recognition is an initial step in realizing that the slave trade is a global problem. The people who step into slavery today don't usually get kidnapped or knocked over the head. They come into slavery because someone has asked them this question: want a job? Men, women, and children are persuaded, kidnapped, and placed into slavery all over the world. With an estimated 21 to 36 million people in slavery, approximately 22% are trapped in forced prostitution slavery. The other 78% toil in forced labor in industries where manual labor is needed. Out of all these slaves, 26% today's slaves are children. The human slave trade has been constantly increasing over the past 2 centuries. The sex and labor exchange has risen due to widespread negligence worldwide. Sex trafficking primarily involves exploitation, which comes in many forms, including forcing victims into prostitution, subjecting victims to slavery or involuntary servitude, and compelling victims to commit sex acts for the purpose of creating pornography.
I do think the sex industry has increased, for sure. Kids, adults being sold for sex. I do think that has increased because I believe sex addiction has increased in the world. There's 2 million kids who are forced into the commercial sex trade. What kind of demand justifies that number, right? That's a lot of sex addicts. The science behind pornography proves it is a drug. It dements your mind. And that's what happens to people. They become demented, brain damaged, and they start desiring children and things. So we've created pornography has created sex addicts that eventually want to engage in sex with children. So child sex slavery, I believe, has skyrocketed because of that.
This multi-billion-dollar business is the second largest industry in the world, right behind the drug industry. It generates $150 billion each year in illicit profits for traffickers. In the United States, a large majority of sex trafficking victims don't get kidnapped or forced into slavery. Many children run away from home or get placed into foster care. They begin to feel unwanted, so they start looking around. Pretty soon, a pimp comes along and starts taking care of the child. During this grooming period, the pimp spoils the victim by buying them many different objects, giving them fake love, and takes them on adventures all over the country. The pimp begins to gain psychological and emotional control over the victim. Pretty soon, the pimp tells the victim that they will have to commit sex acts in order to help provide for the family. This victim will be placed into prostitution or sex trafficking rings where they will be raped multiple times a day. 78% of the slaves today are men, women, and children who are forced into manual labor. Labor trafficking is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor services through the use of force or fraud for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery. Forced labor affects millions of men, women, and children around the world and is most frequently found in labor-intensive industries.
There was a time when slavery was considered to be morally acceptable and economically necessary. Those days are over. And it's in all sorts of industries, from fishing to mines to timber operations to rubber plantations, to some sweatshop labor in sewing factories.
These slaves are owned by another person who buys, uses, and sells them just like any other piece of property. 22% of these slaves are child slaves who are thrown into bondage and forced to work until the day they die or are freed. Ale, a former slave, tells his story about working in the cocoa industry. He expresses, "The beatings were a part of my life. I'd seen others who had tried to escape. When they tried, they were severely beaten." However, in the vast majority of cases, forced labor is used by the private individuals who are seeking to make profit from the exploitation of other people. Victims of forced labor are frequently from the minority or marginalized groups who face institutionalized discrimination and live on the margins of society where they are vulnerable to slavery practices. There are more slaves today, an estimated 21 to 36 million people, than at any time in the world's history. However, with the world population growing at a fast pace, this represents the smallest fraction of the global population to be enslaved. In addition, it is the tiniest proportion of the global economy to ever be represented by slave labor. The demands of the world have blinded the human's eyes to see the sickening devastation of mothers, fathers, daughters, brothers, and children being raped and forced to work to their death. Whether it is called human trafficking, forced labor, slavery, or slavery-like practices, victims of modern slavery have their freedom denied and are used and controlled and exploited by another person for profit, sex, or the thrill of domination.